Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for some more Saturn versus PlayStation action, and today without a doubt we have got our most monumental battle yet. I'm talking about the most sought after, possibly the most rarest RPG from its era, Panzer Dragoon Saga on the Sega Saturn, squaring off against the most popular, the most well-known probably RPG of all time, Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation. Now I have to be honest, because these weren't two games that I was going to compare originally, but I've had several people ask for the comparison video for Final Fantasy VII versus Panzer Dragoon Saga. Obviously Final Fantasy VII came out in January of 1997, Panzer Dragoon Saga came out a whole year later in January of 1998, so it's a kind of a mismatch in terms of time frame, because in 1 year video games change so dramatically, especially back then, and they're not really a similar style of RPG either, but I'm going to do my best to compare them in the looks, in the sound, in the gameplay, in the content and lifespan, and we're going to come up with an overall winner. Currently the PlayStation has a 1-point lead, 7 wins to 6. So is the PlayStation going to extend its lead, or can the Saturn pull it back and equalize the series at 7 wins apiece? So like I always do, I'm going to start with visuals first. I'm going to start with Final Fantasy VII this week because I covered Panzer Dragoon Saga just a short while back in a separate review. And for January of 1997, I believe Final Fantasy VII was the very best looking game on any system at the time. It combined absolutely beautiful 2D pre-rendered backdrops with 3D graphics, which gave it a great mix and a great sense of variety. The great thing with using the 2D pre-rendered backdrops is A, they still look pretty good in this day and age and you could have far more detailed environments, and B, they take up far less space on a disc than all of the 3-dimensional polygonal effects, meaning you can have hundreds or if not thousands of different locations on a game, and that is exactly what Final Fantasy VII does, meaning it has such an amazing sense of variety. And all the different towns and the locations that you explore, they all are truly unique, and the game benefits so much for it because the variety means you never get bored of seeing all these different places. Now, as well as having fantastic 2D pre-rendered backdrops, it has a brilliant 3D battle system where you see the characters in full 3D, and they are really good character models, definitely the best on the system for the time. And combined with that, you have got an amazing variety of magic spells, special moves and summons that just get better and better as the game go along. I mean, the summons are truly spectacular when you get to the more powerful ones. There really isn't anything on the system that compared with them at this point in time. And as well as that, you've got a fantastic 3D world map as well. It's not got much pop-up, it runs really nice, it's crisp and clear. So overall in the looks department, I haven't got a single negative thing to say about Final Fantasy VII. So moving across to Panzer Dragoon Saga, and it's really difficult to compare the two accurately because Panzer Dragoon Saga is a fully 3D game, whereas only part of Final Fantasy VII is 3D, and unfortunately in the looks department this is Panzer Dragoon Saga's downfall. Because the couple of town locations are fully 3D, they don't have the levels of detail that those pre-rendered backdrops do on Final Fantasy VII, and there are far more places to explore, far more things to see on Final Fantasy VII. In terms of sheer graphical variety, Final Fantasy VII absolutely spanks Panzer Dragoon Saga in terms of locations to explore. Now, in terms of in-game battle graphics, the 3D enemies that you face hold up very well against Final Fantasy VII. They're pretty much just as good in my eyes. The downside is there are far less enemies to face off against, far less bosses to experience, and far less moves, techniques, magic spells, anything like that on Panzer Dragoon Saga. And what you have on Final Fantasy VII completely destroys anything that Panzer Dragoon Saga can summon up. The most powerful special moves on Panzer Dragoon Saga just look nothing in comparison to the summons and your limit breaks on Final Fantasy VII. And overall in the looks department, Panzer Dragoon Saga just comes up short because of its lack of variety, and what is here overall doesn't stand the test of time as good as Final Fantasy VII. So in the looks department, Final Fantasy VII is the victor. So moving on to the sound effects and music, and we're going to stay with Panzer Dragoon Saga, and when I reviewed it a few weeks back, I didn't say a single negative thing about this game in that regard. It has fantastic sound effects, and it also has a truly brilliant soundtrack that managed to surpass not only Panzer Dragoon, but Panzer Dragoon Zwei as well, and that is no small feat because they are fantastic sounding games. The musical tracks here create a wonderful sense of atmosphere, and they are really, really good stuff. They fit the game and the loneliness of flying around wonderfully. There really isn't anything bad I can say about Panzer Dragoon in the sound effects and music. So moving across to Final Fantasy VII, and there really is only one issue for Panzer Dragoon Saga in comparison to Final Fantasy VII. Unfortunately, it's a very big one, and that is that in my eyes, Final Fantasy VII has the greatest video game soundtrack of all time. There is nothing that Panzer Dragoon can do to stand against Final Fantasy VII because it has some of the most memorable, some of the highest quality video game music of all time. There are so many tracks within this game that are of such world-class quality that there is simply no game on the planet that can stand with Final Fantasy VII in the sound effects department. Now, the guy that composed the music, Nobuo Uematsu, I believe his name, I may well have butchered his name, but he has done an amazing job here with Final Fantasy VII because from the battle music to all the different musics within the towns, this game gives you emotion, it gives you drama, it gives you suspense and an excitement feeling that is just unmatched in my eyes by any video game before or after or at that period of time, period. There is nothing that compares with Final Fantasy VII in the music department. So what I'm going to do is give you a few tracks just so you can see why I think this game is so good in this area. So sticking with Final Fantasy VII for gameplay, and what we've got actually here is a nice variety, and sometimes you don't always get that with RPGs. Sometimes they can be quite repetitive with endless random battles, but Final Fantasy VII combines a nice mixture of exploring with the random battle system. Now, controlling your character exploring the areas is probably something that some people might find tricky to get used to because you've got just a standard D-pad, you don't have analog control here. So when you move from different areas, because of the pre-rendered backdrops and the angles they're portrayed at, it can be a little bit disorientating pressing up on the D-pad and finding out you don't quite move up on the screen how you'd want to, but that's something you get used to, and it's actually kind of like a quirky charm to the game in all fairness. Moving on to the way it plays in battle, and probably for me this is one of the very best turn-based battle systems on any RPG ever. It's so good, it really is, and it's addictive, and there's so much depth to it as well because of the amount of different materials that you can get, whether it's green magic, summon magic, yellow magic, the amount of limit breaks that you can learn, hunting for your ultimate weapons. There is so much depth to the game and the equipment system within the game, it is so good. I haven't got anything negative to say about that. And as well as that, the game has little bits of variety in terms of other things that you can do, whether it's escaping Midgar on the motorcycle, whether it's riding a chocobo or catching chocobo, raising chocobos, or even playing the snowboarding game, and other things within the Gold Saucer too, which keeps the game fresh, and it means it doesn't get boring when you're playing it at all. So moving back over to Panzer Dragoon Saga for gameplay, and if you watched my review, you'll know that I said Panzer Dragoon Saga can get repetitive. It's much more simplified in terms of its overall structure than Final Fantasy VII. It doesn't have the depth in terms of the items and the equipment and the moves, anything like that. The leveling up of the dragon, it's pretty systematic. It doesn't have the variety that Final Fantasy VII does in any of that aspect. In terms of exploring on the dragon, I think this was the biggest criticism I had, because when you're flying around a lot of these areas, it feels quite dull, it feels quite slow and tedious. A lot of the time you're just moving to open a switch, to open something, to go back and go through a door. It feels quite daunting, and it doesn't give you a great sense of enjoyment. And moving on to the way it plays in battle, I said the battle system seems quite novel to start with, moving around to get different angles on the enemies to attack from their weakest points, but unfortunately the novelty of that wears off really quick, and when you're doing the battles you just rely on your gun and your lasers for pretty much the whole game. A lot of your special moves are redundant apart from your healing and defensive ones. So overall in the gameplay department, Panzer Dragoon Saga just doesn't have the variety that Final Fantasy VII does, which means in the gameplay department Final Fantasy VII is the victor again. So sticking with Panzer Dragoon Saga for content and lifespan, you've got around about 15 hours of gameplay here, and that's done at a leisurely pace, not rushing it, and at the same time not trying to explore every single nook and cranny of the maps. If you want 100% map coverage, you may well look at around 20 hours of gameplay, but a lot of that playtime will be pretty dull and repetitive, I can't deny that. There aren't really any major side quests or anything like that. There's no hunting for different equipment. There are very few weapons that you can buy and upgrade as the game progresses, and in terms of content and lifespan, it's certainly not one of the most fulfilling RPGs from that era, I should say. A lot of the other Saturn RPGs probably had double the lifespan the Shining Force 3 ones. Even a game like Albert Odyssey has more content and lifespan than this. So content and lifespan definitely not Panzer Dragoon Saga's strong point. So moving over to Final Fantasy VII for content and lifespan, and I can summarize it by simply saying this. Final Fantasy VII's first disc has more content than all of Panzer Dragoon Saga's 4 discs added together. There are far more locations to explore, far more characters to get involved with, much more intricate storyline elements. Right from the get-go, the storyline of Final Fantasy VII has you gripped. It draws on your emotions, it gets you really sucked in, and you're desperate to see how it unfolds. Panzer Dragoon Saga just simply doesn't have this quality. You do not feel an emotional attachment to the characters in the game, and that is a fundamental flaw in an RPG in my opinion, because they're storyline driven, and Final Fantasy VII completely demolishes Panzer Dragoon Saga in the storyline aspect. And in terms of content, there are way more of everything on Final Fantasy VII. Characters, spells, equipment, summons, limit breaks, all of that really puts a nail in the coffin for Panzer Dragoon Saga in terms of extra things to do. I've already said about it, raising chocobos, going around collecting master summons, defeating the ultimate bosses. There is nothing like this in Panzer Dragoon Saga, which means in the content and lifespan, Final Fantasy VII is an absolute runaway winner. So of course that means it's time to come up with an overall winner, and when you compare the games completely in all their elements, I think you can't really deny that Final Fantasy VII is a better looking game overall, and that Final Fantasy VII has far more content and lifespan and stuff for you to do. Now in terms of music and gameplay, it's a little bit more subjective, because some people will prefer the more tranquil style of music that Panzer Dragoon has to offer, but for me, because Final Fantasy VII has so much more music, and in my eyes it is of a higher quality and much more varied. That's why I said Final Fantasy VII's got the best video game soundtrack of all time. I think it's really hard to compete with it in any aspect. And in terms of gameplay, some people will prefer a much simpler RPG like Panzer Dragoon Saga, where you don't need as much thought because there's far less depth to the way it plays and to the equipment system and skills and all of that. And Final Fantasy VII has so much more than that. It is far more in depth, and that is why I love the way it plays. Now, if you didn't know, Final Fantasy VII is my favorite video game of all time, so of course I was always gonna be favorable towards it, but I think in every aspect it simply is better than Panzer Dragoon Saga, which means Final Fantasy VII comes out on top this week, which means the PlayStation takes an 8-6 lead overall. Now, of course, these are just my thoughts and my thoughts alone, and I always love to hear what other people have to say about the games that I compare and whether people agree or disagree and reasons why. So let me know with your comments down below. That is it today. Thank you for watching, and I will be back in the near future with another comparison video. Goodbye for now.